On November 7th, I was in my office in New York, and it was pretty quiet in America, but there was a great deal of turmoil in East Germany, the GDR, people pouring out of the country. The Politburo seemed to be in chaos. And one of my colleagues, our foreign editor, Jerry Lamprecht, came to me and said, why don't you go to Germany? There's not much going on here, and do the show from Berlin for a couple of days. I went to lunch and thought about it and talked to some friends of mine who were in the diplomatic service, and they said, that seemed like a good idea. So I went back to the office, we made these arrangements, and I quietly slipped out of town on Monday night because I didn't want my competition to know that I had gone to Berlin. I had no idea that the events would unfold in the fashion that they did, obviously. But on the Tuesday that I arrived, I was immediately able to go into the eastern sector of Berlin and do some reporting as long as I got out of there by nightfall. Those were the rules. I was able to have a fair amount of access up and down the streets, talk to some residents of the GDR, although not to any political people. One of my colleagues in Europe, Michel Neubert, who was the head of our Frankfurt bureau, had made arrangements for me to interview Günter Schabowski the next day. He was the East German propaganda chief. I got up early the next morning and I worked during the day again in the eastern sector. We were trying to decide whether I should try to go live that night back to America or whether I would just tape the broadcast and then feed elements of it back to the United States. But we did have a satellite transmission path booked, which turned out to be very fortuitous indeed. I went to the Schabowski News Conference, which is now well known. He droned on for most of an hour. I was very struck by the vigor of the GDR correspondents, that you could tell that they'd been infused with the new spirit. They were challenging him about elections and about freedom of the press. So it was a different time. But it was late in the afternoon, and warm. The room was warm. People were starting to nod off when Schabowski pulled out this statement from the Politburo and announced a new policy, saying that residents of the GDR could apply the next morning for a visa at 8 a.m. and go out and return through any of the portals in the Berlin Wall. When he read that, it was as if an alien force had invaded the room. People shook their heads, looked at each other and said, are we hearing it correctly? I had an all-German camera crew, Joe Urschler, who'd been around here for a long time, and Heinrich Walling, who'd grown up in Berlin. They both looked at me wide-eyed and got very excited. But there was confusion as the press conference broke up. What did it mean exactly? Did we hear the right thing? So I rushed upstairs to have my interview with Schabowski. He got out the piece of paper again, put on his glasses and read it, and I said, does this take effect immediately? And he looked at me and he said, immediately. And then he smiled, a kind of a goofy smile. I ran downstairs, called the office from my car phone, let my fellow correspondents who were puzzling over this piece of paper know that it now appears the wall is down. By the time we got to Checkpoint Charlie, the guard, who had normally given us kind of a bad time, just was going to wave us through. I got out with my interpreter and asked him if he was aware of what was going on. He said he was. And then I said, what do you think? And he looked at me for a moment, smiled, and said, I'm not paid to think. I got back to our office at the hotel. A lot of chaos in New York. They were organized a broadcast that night. We were on the air several times during the day. We did have the satellite transmission booked, and we made arrangements at Brandenburg Gate to get a platform for me and a cherry picker, a high position for the camera to look down on the other side. By the time I got to Brandenburg Gate at about 11:30, I think, Berlin time, 5:30 in America, a lot of West German students and young people had gathered on top of the wall, and they were cheering for the East Germans to come across at that point. But the East German guards then began to hose them off, resorting to their old tactics. And they were driven off, except one man stood there with his arms outstretched. It turned out he was intoxicated. He'd been living over in the woods. He had no idea what was going on. Then the West German students got back up again. There was some more hosing down. This time they couldn't be moved. Meanwhile, we'd sent camera crews up and down the wall to look for people coming through, and one of our very best little cameramen from London came running up to me with eyes wide, and he handed me a video cassette and said, I have it. They're coming through the wall. So we went on the air at 6:30 New York time, 12:30 in Berlin, and I had to say to the control room in New York, just stay with me. I'm going to have to ad-lib this entire broadcast because There's so much noise, so much chaos. It's changing so rapidly. We'll just try to keep up with what's going on. We did a lot of updates. We then began doing special reports at 10 o'clock prime time. And somewhere around 1:30 in the morning, Berlin time, one of my computer technicians came to me, opened his hand, and handed me a piece of the wall. The chiseling had begun. Young people were up there with picks and hammers and chisels, taking down the wall physically. Early in the morning, I said into the camera, I always believed that 1968 would be the most profound year of change in my journalistic career. I ticked off all that had happened that year. Lyndon Johnson did not run for president. We lost 16,000 Americans in Vietnam. Dr. King was killed. Bobby Kennedy was assassinated. We had the riots in Chicago. We made a circumnavigation of the moon that same year. And then I ticked off all that had gone on in 1989, and I said the year is not half over yet, or the year is almost over and we don't know what is yet to come. So it was, for me, a very memorable time for a lot of reasons. From a journalistic point of view, I was in the right place at the right time with a great group of colleagues. From a personal point of view, as a child of the Cold War, I never thought this would occur during my lifetime. And then finally, as I've said, as a citizen, in the days and the months and the weeks and the years that came after, I came to appreciate the skill and the statesmanship of the leaders of the West and the East, Mikhail Gorbachev in Russia, Helmut Kohl in Germany, and President George Bush 41 in America. These were men who were very familiar with World War II and the Cold War and the perils that came with those. And it helped, I think, form their political and diplomatic sensibilities. And they got through that time without one tank rolling, without one shot being fired, without anybody being hanged in the East German sector. It was extraordinary in terms of its peacefulness. And it changed the world. It was one of the most dramatic nights of the 20th century.